Maybe first start with the Golden State Killer?
Sure, yeah. I've been doing a lot of interesting research into the Golden State Killer case basically for the past 2 weeks. I mean, obviously, the perpetrator who's been publicly identified in the media is Joseph James DeAngelo after the DNA hit in April last year. But I decided to just go back to the forums that were actually discussing the Golden State Killer case for the past couple years. And there's this ProBoards forum that you might be familiar with, earonsgsk.proboards.com, and I think it's been open since 2013. And what I started to realize was that they had been discussing a lot of broader connections to the case, discussing the possibilities that there were actual political motives behind many of the murders, and most interestingly, they actually had many other suspects who, in a lot of ways, fit the profile better than Joseph DeAngelo. So that was what I've pretty much been spending the past 2 weeks doing, is trying to piece together who these suspects are, because the forum has this policy of not being willing to name any of the suspects, like specifically, so they come up with all these code names for them. Like one of the biggest suspects who they have is who they had was named Mr. Y. And there are also people named like Mr. X and Mr. Z, and they're just using all of this weird code language that you can't really decipher, but I was able to follow some of the clues and figure out who they were. So first of all, I mean, before I get into them, the ProBoards forum had this special section. It was like the VIP section, where you have to ask an administrator for permission, and then they let you in. And this VIP section was discussing all of these persons of interest who you couldn't name publicly. And it turns out that right at the time that Joseph DeAngelo was identified, they pretty much just deleted the entire VIP folder, so all of that discussion is now gone, and no one can access it, which is unfortunate, and sort of seems like they're already beginning to adhere to the lone killer narrative. But in any case, I've been able to figure out who a few of these people are, and there are some very interesting reasons to believe that many of them are involved. The first and biggest person of interest is called Mr. Y. And Mr. Y was described as, well, he's been described as a Vietnam veteran who was held as a prisoner of war for 5 years, and after he was released, he went back home in California. His home was actually the town of Visalia, which is where the Visalia ransacker crimes took place, and those are suspected of being perpetrated by the Golden State Killer. So this guy, Mr. Y, grew up in Visalia, was a Vietnam veteran, was a POW, and then he came back, and right at the time that he came back, the Visalia ransacking started. And just by piecing together those clues, I was able to find that the real name for Mr. Y is Terry Lee Boyer. Boyer would be spelled B-O-Y-E-R, and Terry Boyer was an Air Force captain, lieutenant colonel when he retired. He was born into a very wealthy, he was adopted by a very wealthy family. He was a fairly prominent guy. He was a fitness fanatic who looked really young, and he actually spent a while serving at Mather Air Force Base, which has a significant connection to one of the crimes in the Golden State Killer's reign of terror. So Terry Boyer he's a military guy. He was living in the right places at the right times. But what's very interesting is that there are allegations on the forums that there is actually hard physical evidence that linked him to the Visalia ransacker crimes. According to a bunch of people who claim they have inside sources from the police department, Terry Boyer's fingerprints were found at 3 of the Visalia ransacker crime scenes.
Hmm.
Yeah, and apparently so first of all, I guess before going into that, how familiar are you with the Golden State Killer overall and the Visalia ransacker?
Yeah, I made a video about it. Only I investigated mostly the drug trafficking connections, so I don't know anything about alternative suspects or things like that.
Right. Well, I mean, the first thing I want to point out is, I mean, when you talk about drug trafficking, that was going on at Mather Air Force Base, and the Maggiores, Brian and Kate Maggiore, were killed apparently by the East Area rapist, and that's suspected to have been a hit. Like, I mean, I guess a lot of people, you seem to indicate in the video, and a lot of people do believe that Brian Maggiore stumbled across drug trafficking activities going on at Mather, and that's why he was murdered. And that makes it interesting that Terry Boyer was actually not just working at Mather Air Force Base, he was actually leading one of the Air Force training squadrons at the time, at the same exact time that the Maggiores were working there. So he has that connection to the victims, and he has many other connections too. Here's one interesting thing. There was an Oldsmobile car that was used in one of the murders. I can't recall exactly which one at the moment, but this Oldsmobile car was owned by, I think the person's name was Michael Manier, and it just so happens that Michael Manier's father, Ellsworth Manier, was well acquainted with Terry Boyer. So you have that connection. You have the fact that one of the Visalia ransacker victims, someone who actually got murdered, named Claude Snelling, was a professor at the College of the Sequoias, and the College of the Sequoias is where Terry Boyer studies. Other connections. Basically, like he was linked to the victims in all these different ways. He was allegedly leaving behind physical evidence at the Visalia ransacker crime scene, and the detective who actually confronted the Visalia ransacker actually believed that Terry Boyer was the person who attacked him. Basically, because near the end of the Visalia ransacker crime spree, the police were finally sort of wising up to what was going on, and they were staking out places where they thought the attacks were going to occur. And Visalia detective Bill McGowan was involved in the stakeout, and he actually caught the Visalia ransacker in the act.
There was a shootout, right?
What?
There was a shootout.
That's what I'm talking about, the shootout. And so Bill McGowan was involved in the shootout. I mean, the Visalia ransacker shot a flashlight instead of him, so luckily he survived. But what's interesting is that right after the shootout, Bill McGowan gave a statement to the media where he says, I think I can identify this guy. He says, I think I've met them before. Let me pull up the exact words. He says, I know I can identify him. There's no question about that. I may have even seen him before or even talked to him. So it means that Bill McGowan somehow came across the Visalia ransacker in his life in some other way before getting into the firefight with them. And someone who posted on the Pro Boards forums, who was apparently related by marriage to McGowan's family, said that he talked to McGowan's brother at one point. And apparently McGowan's brother told him that Mr. Y, whose name is Terry Boyer, as we said, was one of McGowan's biggest POIs in the case. So back then, McGowan believed that Terry Boyer was a Visalia ransacker, and he apparently tried to convince the Sacramento police to connect the Visalia ransacker to the East Area rapist, and he might have even told them about Terry Boyer as well. So that's just a very interesting that all of these. There's this guy who has so many connections. He has a military background, and allegedly even has physical evidence linking him to the crimes, and yet he was never, and yet, you know, his name is not even really public at all. He's officially just been cleared. And I thought that was, I mean, a pretty interesting look into the hidden underbelly of the Golden State Killer case.
I really hope someone has made a backup of all the material somewhere.
Yeah, I've been trying to see if it exists anywhere. And I mean, I've been successful at identifying most of the unnamed suspects. There's just one who I couldn't yet identify, and I'll get into that a bit later.
How many potential suspects were described on this website?
Well, so there was Mr. Y, which is Terry Boyer. There was also someone named Mr. Z, or Person Z, who owned a dog, which has a connection to some of the original Night Stalker crimes, and I can get into that in just a second. There was also someone named Mr. X, who was a business partner of Mr. Z, and apparently, like, some people actually thought that Mr. X was the owner of the dog, but he was really just house-sitting the dog for Mr. Z. And what's interesting is that Mr. Y and Mr. Z actually lived not that far from each other, and Mr. X has some connections to Iran-Contra CIA drug trafficking activities, and some of Mr. X's children knew a local, hoodlum, possible mafia-connected guy named Brett Glaspie, who was another suspect in the original Night Stalker crimes, and who allegedly died in Mexico in 1982. So I'm about to elaborate in more detail on who these people are, but it just goes to show that there's this big web of military-connected suspects and organized crime-related suspects.
Law enforcement.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we have D'Angelo, who was a cop, and there's some people are talking about the possibility that he framed somebody for a murder, and I'll get into that later, but I do not think that it was D'Angelo alone. I think that there were probably multiple perpetrators and that many of these crimes were committed with purpose. So,
yep.
First of all, yeah, go ahead.
No, even a retired police detective Paul Holz testified that later.
Oh, he actually testified that he thought that some of the crimes were committed?
Yeah, he went on public television.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that before. I'll have to look at that. So, the thing is, with Terry Boyer, allegedly, he was cleared by DNA multiple times, which seems kind of weird. Like, why exactly would somebody need to be cleared by DNA 3 or 4 times, if you're so adamant that he's not the guy? And I think it really shows that, I mean, the guy was such a compelling person of interest that many people, even people in law enforcement, did not believe that the DNA clearing was actually legitimate, and so they had to retest him so many times just to be sure about it. Because he just from everything I've seen, he is one of the most compelling suspects. And I even still harbor some doubts that the DNA that cleared him was really his DNA. I mean, we know from the Franklin case as well that if there's enough political impetus to do it, that DNA tests can be faked. Like in the Franklin case, they said that Robert Wadman was not the father of Alicia Owen's daughter, even though by all accounts he really is. So I think it's certainly not out of the question that DNA can really be manipulated and faked in these cases.
Planted, everything.
Right, and I mean, even with D'Angelo, he may or may not be linked to all of the crimes that the East Area Rapist is accused of. And it's actually kind of interesting that, I mean, he's been indicted for many crimes, even when there's no physical evidence linking him to them. Like, he was indicted, and you've seen this tactic in serial killer cases before, I'm sure, where they know that they can't win the case. Like, for an individual murder, they can't win the case. So they have to stack it all together and just talk about the pattern of what they did. And it's a very prejudicial type of case
Yeah.
And that's really the only way they can secure a conviction.
Also conviction through public opinion, mostly.
Right, yeah. I mean, we've already been, it's almost a year at this point, and everyone has been told that the Golden State Killer has been caught, and it's D'Angelo. I don't even know how you could possibly find someone for the jury who doesn't know this news already. So, I mean, you have these very manipulative tactics that show up all over the place. But, I mean, you have, like, for example, I think he was indicted for the Maggiore killing, even though I'm not aware of any physical evidence that links that to the Golden State Killer case at all. I think he was indicted for the murder of Claude Snelling, even though there's also no definitive physical evidence there. And all this time, so, I mean, they're just going to roll it all up into one case and say that, well, DNA proved he committed these murders, and we think that these murders are connected to those other murders, therefore he should be convicted on all counts, which is a kind of dubious way to do a trial. And we also saw that same thing with Rodney Alcala. If you read Dave McGowan's chapter in the Laurel Canyon book on that, you know, they basically just consolidated all of Rodney Alcala's crimes into one big trial and just sort of stacked them all together and got the jury to find him guilty on the aggregate rather than actually proving he did any one crime. So we see that, these same tactics, and I think what's interesting is that, you know, before we've only been able to do post-mortems of serial killer cases that already happened. But this time we actually get to watch it as it unfolds. We get to see how the trial progresses in real time. And that might actually be a first for the community of people like us who research serial killer cases. So I think that'll be a very interesting experience for us.
Most definitely, yeah.
But anyway, aside from Mr. Y, whose DNA clearing is kind of questionable, there are a couple other major suspects to get into. First of all, there's at two of the original Night Stalker crimes, the Offerman Manning murders and then also the Domingo Sanchez murders, there's evidence that there was a three-toed white German Shepherd that the killer apparently brought to the crime scene. And this dog's name is Woofy. Now, there's been some controversy as to whether it's exactly the same dog at both crime scenes, but it certainly appears that that is the case. First of all, you know, even the mainstream media, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times which says that there's no doubt that at the Offerman Manning crime scene there was a paw print left behind from a three-toed white German Shepherd, and near the Domingo Sanchez crime scene, there were witnesses who saw a dog, like right around the time of the murders, and according to the daughter of Sherry Domingo, who was posting on the forums, the police told her that there definitely was a dog brought to the crime scene. So even though we don't have, I guess, absolute proof, it seems very likely that the same dog, Woofy, was at both ONS crime scenes. And what's interesting is what happens when you try to piece together who actually owned the dog. And according to the posts that I've seen on the Pro Board's forums, the dog was owned by a relatively, prominent man in the Santa Barbara area. And this person was given the name Mr. Z, or Person Z. He was very active in real estate. One of his sons was also very active in real estate. And the initials of this man were SDL. And I finally was able to come up with his actual name. He's Silvio Di Loretto, who was a major real estate agent in Santa Barbara, and was connected to all these big organizations. So he's another wealthy and powerful man. And Silvio Di Loretto is the owner of Woofy, and he lived not very far from Terry Boyer. Now, Silvio Di Loretto apparently had a business partnership with somebody who I haven't been able to find their identity yet. I've only been able to find the name Mr. X. And so basically he would sometimes, so both of these people lived in Santa Barbara County. I mean, Silvio Di Loreto lived in Santa Barbara, and I think Mr. X lived in Goleta, which is a city where many of the ONS crimes occurred. Mr. X would house sit Woofy from time to time on behalf of Silvio Di Loreto, and Mr. X had a couple of children, and some of his children were acquainted with another man in Goleta named Brett Glaspie. Now, Brett Glaspie was, he was known, yeah? Is there something you wanted to say?
No.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I guess there's interference in the call. So, Brett Glaspie was basically a local, local thug, more or less. He was involved in drug trafficking or drug dealing. He was known to raid marijuana farms, and he was known to be, by the locals, to be incredibly violent. And like one girl from Goleta said, yeah, I knew Brett Glaspie. He was so violent that no girl would date him. Like, he would beat up anyone who crossed his path. He was allegedly involved in beating up the janitor of Dr. Robert Offerman, who was one of the ONS victims. And ultimately, he ended up in Mexico for some reason with his brother and got in this got murdered and was the circumstances are very murky there. He was taken, I think he was allegedly taken back to the U.S., but there was no real funeral that was held, no real memorial, so some people speculate that his death was faked. And they basically talked about the possibility that, there were a lot of mafia families in, there were a lot of organized crime figures in Santa Barbara at the time, like entire families who were involved in this, and sometimes they would disappear, and then they would reappear, and they would look completely different. They'd have plastic surgery and makeovers. And so this girl from Goleta was speculating that maybe Brett Glaspie and his whole family was involved in some kind of mafia dealing, and he had his death faked in Mexico and then reappeared, and then was brought back in disguise. So, Brett Glaspie, the final allegation is that Brett Glaspie is also said to have owned that same dog, Woofy, that was also at the ONS crime scene. According to this Goleta girl, he also owned a 3-toed white German Shepherd and may have taken it to raid when he was raiding marijuana farms. So he has this dog, Woofy, who connects whoever the ONS was, to Silvio Di Loreto, to Mr. X, to Brett Glaspie. And it's actually, it's pretty interesting, and it sort of implies that all of these people who are involved in real estate or organized crime and drug running in the Santa Barbara area might have all been somehow linked to the Golden State Killer's crime spree. It's not exactly clear who, if they knew what was going on, but it shows, the milieu that there was, that this dog was being passed around between all of these different people. And
I've never heard about that angle. Never. Or I've never read about it. But everything was on the board.
Yeah, the forums have a wealth of information, and it's really, it's unfortunate that all of this VIP discussion has pretty much gone away now, and may not be accessible anymore. It kind of honestly makes me wish that I had gotten involved in the forum before the Golden State Killer case broke with D'Angelo, because the funny thing is, I had actually registered on the forum like 2 months before the D'Angelo news came out for a completely different reason. I was trying to investigate some stuff involving the Cabazon Reservation and like what Danny Castellaro was researching. A chemist named Sid Seymour, who was allegedly a satanic cultist who abused his own daughter, and some people were posting about him on the forum, so I signed up just so I could learn some more about the case, and I didn't even bother to participate in the Golden State Killer discussion at the time, and now I really wish that I did, because I might have been able to get into that VIP section. But in any case, I've been able to piece together most of the people who were named. Like, we know Mr. Y is Terry Boyer. We know Mr. Z is Silvio Di Loretto. We know about Brett Glaspie. The only person that we don't know is Mr. X, who was, the business partner of Silvio Di Loretto. And maybe someone who is listening and is good at sleuthing will be able to find out who this is. Now, Mr. X is apparently linked to a CIA drug runner named William Morgan Hetrick. And William Morgan Hetrick was involved in this 1982 criminal trial involving major drug trafficking that was going on in Southern California. He was indicted along with John DeLorean, like the car business mogul, and one other person. But basically, Morgan Hetrick was a sort of a well-known, flashy pilot figure. He was connected to a computer businessman in California named Fletcher Jones. And what's curious about Morgan Hetrick is that allegedly he was one of the pilots for Maverick Air. And, you remember Maverick Air, right, from your video? The company that Lyman Smith worked for, that he basically invested in?
Yeah, tell me.
Right. Maverick Air was flying cows to Iran back when there was still the Shah, before the revolution that overthrew him. So at the time it was pretty much a CIA puppet. Now, there was a lot of shady business going on with Maverick Air. Finances were, not being well accounted for. Apparently a lot of people were skimming money off the top. Planes were, the planes that flew cows there were sometimes not actually, sometimes not actually carrying their intended cargo or coming back with what they should be. So there was a lot of stuff being unaccounted for, and the speculation is that Maverick basically turned into a drug running enterprise, or a weapons trafficking, all these different rat lines used to carry illicit cargo. It's believed that Maverick was involved in that. And if Morgan Hetrick was a pilot for Maverick, which I haven't been able to confirm, but a lot of people seem to talk about it as fact, and it seems plausible, then you have yet another connection there with a pilot for Maverick Air who is a CIA asset, more or less, is linked to Mr. X, who house sits the dog that was used by the ONS. So, there you have just another way in which this whole criminal enterprise seems to be linked to the Golden State Killer crime spree. Now, the other thing is that there is another. So, first of all, you kind of brought up before the possibility, I think, that D'Angelo's brother might have been an accomplice in some of the crimes. Are you at least familiar with that idea?
Yeah, I think even the composite sketches alluded to that fact.
Yeah. And obviously, sketches of suspects are not always the most accurate. Like, there is some room for discrepancies, but when you see sketches that don't actually look alike, and yet there's claims that they're all the same serial killer, it really just seems very suspicious to me. There's always this assumption that if there is a similar spree of crime, that it must all be by one person, and yet we've seen so many examples, like with the Son of Sam, showing that, or the Atlanta child killings, showing that just because murders are being committed in a similar way doesn't automatically mean that it has to be one person. It could easily be a group of people that are involved in the same sort of criminal conspiracy with each other, a cult, a criminal enterprise, both. So there's a lot of speculation that D'Angelo's brother is involved, and D'Angelo's brother has a burglary record, nothing more serious than that. But there were, for a time, some allegations, and these have been, I think, debunked at this point, but there were allegations that D'Angelo's brother was a real estate agent. Now, the name, like, John D'Angelo is the guy's name, and there is a John D'Angelo who's a real estate agent, but the middle name does not match, so it's probably not the same guy. But in any case, something that's interesting is that in 2017, like a year before the D'Angelo news broke, somebody came onto the Pro Board forums and talked about how they believe that their father might have been linked to the Golden State Killer. The person who went on the forums was named Russell Boston, and his father was Silas Boston, who was a prolific burglar and also a murderer. And he believed that his father and an apprentice were sort of working together, and this apprentice was actually the killer. And at one point, he talked about how his father and the apprentice worked for a real estate agent that had an Italian name, and then they actually tossed out a possible name, and they said D'Angelo. So a whole year before the D'Angelo news breaks, this person is talking about how his father worked for a real estate agent with the name D'Angelo. So we're seeing that name come up in the case a year before the D'Angelo news even breaks. Now, the other possibility is, it could be a different Italian name as well, and someone asked, well, could it have been Silvio Di Loreto? And unfortunately, Russell Boston's reply is no longer available. He apparently edited all of his comments to remove the information for some reason. So I don't know if he said yes or no about it being Silvio Di Loreto. But, once again, the real estate angle is another thing to look at besides the military angle. I mean, we see military connections with people like Terry Boyer and the Maggiores and the smuggling at Mather Air Force Base. We see real estate connections with Silvio Di Loreto and Silas Boston. We see drug connections and mob connections with Mr. X and Brett Glaspie and, once again, Mather. So, I mean, this is familiar territory for those of us who look into serial killers from the non-mainstream angle. But for most people who study the Golden State Killer case, who are a lot more mainstream in their thinking, they're very prone to say that it's just all a coincidence. And I really don't think it is. I mean, all of these suspects together, all the ways in which they interconnect, makes it seem very likely to me that there was something a lot bigger going on, that many of these crimes were done with purpose. And there were some connections that people were bringing up, some potential motives for crimes that I hadn't even heard about before. Like, for example, one of the women who was murdered, Janelle Cruz, was filing rape charges against someone who was in the military, which would mean that it might be convenient. Someone in a high place might want her to be murdered. I mean, obviously, we already know about the Maggiores. Something interesting about Lyman and Charlene Smith is that in their home, they found a fingerprint on a lamp, and this fingerprint just so happened to be the fingerprint of somebody in witness protection, like FBI witness protection. So it raises the question of, what sort of drama was unfolding in their lives? Why did they have someone in FBI witness protection in their house, their fingerprint left behind there? So there are all sorts of reasons to believe that there is a much bigger story behind the Golden State Killer case. And I don't know to what extent D'Angelo was actually involved, because Terry Boyer already on his own seems like a very good suspect, but I absolutely don't think that there was just one killer. I think there's a good chance it could be multiple. And maybe...
Excuse me. I've always believed that murders were done by individuals, a group of individuals separately from each other, and the rapes and home ransackings were probably done by the same group each time.
Okay, that's interesting as well. I mean, the thing is, like Terry Boyer, there's certainly a lot more definitive evidence. I mean, if the fingerprints allegations are true, there's hard evidence linking him to the ransackings, and there may not be as much the actual, the later rapes and murders. So it's interesting to think about how this group could be. I mean, to think about how this group could actually exist. I mean, did Terry Boyer know D'Angelo in some way? Like, is there actually a continuity between these crimes, or are they taking a lot of different crimes and just trying to fit them together? Because, I mean, we're told that the DNA matched between the EAR and the ONS. We're told that there is a good reason to think that the Visalia ransacker is the EAR/ONS, but obviously we get into a lot of deceptive territory where we don't actually know, and I think there needs to be a lot more research into what were D'Angelo's connections. Like, all these high-level people, Mr. Y, Mr. X, Mr. Z, we can't forget them just because D'Angelo was found. And I think that there is a greater story to be told in how D'Angelo might be linked to these other people. So,
please tell us about that victim who was loitering around the house and met their demise by another couple.
Oh yeah, that was the weirdest thing that I remember in your video, Kippy Vaught, who, yeah, she was at the crime scene of, I think, EAR attack number 28, and she was with a group of teenagers that were outside, hanging around doing whatever, and I think they actually ended up interrupting the EAR attack there. And it was very interesting that she was part of this group of people who stopped the EAR from attacking, and then later she ends up being murdered by supposedly an entirely different serial killer who had nothing to do with it, Gerald and Charlene Gallego. And it's one of those weird things where it could be a coincidence, but it just seems very sketchy to me, and I feel like there has to be some connection there. And when I looked into it, there's a kind of curious indirect connection to between some of the criminal milieu linked to the Golden State Killer case and the Gallego family. And it has to do with something called the UC Davis Sweetheart murders. Have you ever heard of those?
Nope.
All right, so the UC Davis Sweetheart murders happened in 1980, and a couple named John Riggins and Sabrina Gonsalves were murdered. And there were basically a couple different theories of who actually killed them. And the fact is that there were compelling pieces of evidence pointing to all three of these different groups of people, and it raises the question of whether these groups were all acquainted with each other. So first of all, I mean, John Riggins, the first group of suspects is a bunch of basically CIA assets, FBI assets, informants, a group of people by the names of Philip Arthur Thompson, John Gordon Abbott, and Michael Hennessy. And these people were basically career criminals. They met each other in prison. They did all sorts of things. They did murders and rapes. And so in 1980, I guess just to start there was this woman by the name of Valerie McDonald who moved into an apartment, and she had basically Hollywood dreams. And the thing is that soon after she moves into her apartment, a new manager takes over the apartment, and the guy's name is Philip Arthur Thompson. Philip Arthur Thompson is a very creepy guy. I mean, he's a sort of a high intelligence, ruthless serial killer, and we come across all of these serial killers who it seems like they've been framed for a ton of the crimes that they've committed, but Philip Arthur, they've basically been framed for crimes that may have been committed by other sort of killers that are actually agents. Like, what I'm saying is, like, the CIA, for example, they have a lot of trained assassins, professionals, right?
Yes.
And so does the military. And those people are real, like, actual serial killers, not the fake image that the mainstream media presents us. And Philip Arthur Thompson is one of those real serial killers, essentially a professional assassin who was a hitman. He killed for pleasure, but also killed for money. And Philip Arthur Thompson becomes the manager of this apartment where Valerie McDonald is staying. Then, soon after that, John Gordon Abbott and Michael Hennessy also move in as assistant managers. And Valerie McDonald gets very creeped out by the whole arrangement. Like, she talks about how these people, these three men, are holding parties at the apartment where they have large bowls of cocaine. She also talks about how these men are involved in satanic activities. And interestingly enough, I mean, this was in 1980. This was the whole prevailing narrative, is that people only started caring about Satanism because of the satanic panic, which was started by the book Michelle Remembers. And that's basically the narrative that people like Michael Aquino, for example, have been pushing all this time. But we see all this evidence that Satanism has been connected to these crimes, these serial killings, for decades earlier. I mean, it comes up in the Manson case, comes up with Bundy, and it comes up right here with Philip Arthur Thompson and his associates who are practicing Satanism. So Valerie McDonald is really freaked out by this whole thing, and eventually she even flees the apartment at one point because one of the men attacked her. Now, Michael Hennessy promises her a part in a movie, and I think claims that he's supplying drugs to a high-level Hollywood director. And as always, we don't know whether he was telling the truth or not, and the mainstream media assumption is he was lying, but it's actually quite plausible that he could have been telling the truth. In any case, Valerie McDonald vanishes, and her body later gets discovered, I think, in a river. She was murdered by one or some or all of these men. And soon after that, they all begin to flee. They flee north. They go from California to through Oregon, and then end up in British Columbia. And while they're in British Columbia, John Gordon Abbott and Michael Hennessy get into a shootout with the Canadian police, and Michael Hennessy is killed. Abbott is arrested, and ultimately Abbott ends up being freed, and then he pretty much flees the country, goes to the UK, because John Gordon Abbott's father was a British diplomat to the United Nations, and Abbott's mother was a biochemist, she was a geneticist at UC Davis, involved in all sorts of genetic engineering work, which may have been desirable for the bioweapons development that was going on at the time. So anyway, I mean, he has two elite parents, and he flees the country, goes to the UK, and ends up fleeing from there to New Zealand, and he's been there ever since. Now, what's interesting is that John Gordon Abbott's paperboy was John Riggins. So around the same time that the Valerie McDonald murder happened, and around the same time that he's fleeing, there's this murder of their paperboy, John Riggins. So for a while, the police actually suspected that Philip Arthur Thompson might have been, Philip Arthur Thompson, who was an associate of this group who was not in British Columbia, he was actually in California at the time, was somehow involved in this murder. And even though the police never really were able to get evidence on him, one of a homicide detective still believes back in 2010 or so that Philip Arthur Thompson was a good suspect in this crime. And what's weird is that there was this book of matches from British Columbia that was found in John Riggins' van. So the obvious question is, how did this matchbook get from British Columbia into their van where they were killed in UC Davis? And, I mean, we know that Abbott was in British Columbia, so that is an interesting connection. We know that Philip Arthur Thompson was there before he went back to California, right around the time that the murders were committed. So, I mean, that's just one of those weird, anomalous clues that sort of lingered there ever since. And so, I mean, it's quite possible that the Philip Arthur Thompson and Abbott have something to do with it, but the police never got any definitive evidence. Now, the next group that was suspected after that, after Abbott and Thompson, was actually Gerald Gallego's half-brother. I mean, did you know about this, that Gerald Gallego had a half-brother named David Hunt who was under suspicion for this, for other murders?
No.
Yeah, that was a pretty interesting, and I just happened to stumble across this while looking at the Golden State Killer forum. His half-brother David Hunt was sort of acquainted with a gang of other criminals, and the police actually suspected for quite a while that David Hunt and his whole gang had committed the UC Davis sweetheart murders as a copycat murder to try to get his half-brother freed from prison. And I mean, you remember with the Hillside Strangler case, and there was also Veronica Compton who tried to commit a copycat murder to try to get Bianchi freed. You remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so same sort of thing here, where the police believe that David Hunt and his crew committed the sweetheart murders to try to give Gerald and Charlene Gallego an excuse to say that the real killer is still out there, because another crime just like the one you're indicting us for happened and we were in prison. And they actually did try to use this argument at trial, but it was shot down. And for a while they were gathering evidence trying to point to David Hunt and his group, and I think they indicted them at one point. They definitely arrested them, but the case ultimately collapsed because they didn't have any definitive physical evidence linking them. And they ended up testing DNA, and they found that it didn't match. The DNA didn't match Hunt or anyone else in his group. So basically, the interesting thing with the Hunt group is that at the same time that John Gordon Abbott and Philip Arthur Thompson are fleeing to British Columbia, David Hunt and his cellmate end up escaping from prison themselves, and they end up fleeing in basically the same exact direction. In fact, they basically end up in Oregon, in a spot within 10 miles of where Abbott and Thompson are, within just a day of Abbott and Thompson being there. So these two supposedly unconnected groups of criminals are escaping at the same time in the same exact place, which is pretty interesting, and it raises the question of whether Hunt's group is acquainted with Thompson and Abbott's group. And ultimately, none of Hunt's group was arrested for the crime, wasn't charged with the crime. They ultimately pinned it on someone named Richard Hirschfield, who was linked to it by DNA. But a lot of police officers still believe that Hirschfield was really just sort of a flunky, the guy who took the fall for the entire Hunt group. And apparently, one group of people, the Yolo County, wanted to pursue this connection between Hirschfield and the Hunt group, but Sacramento didn't want to pursue the connection. And so there was a bit of an argument, a conflict between the different police departments. So officially there is no connection at all, but a lot of police seem to believe that Hirschfield was really acquainted with this group, working for them. At the same time, there's a belief that the Hunt group is linked to Philip Arthur Thompson's group, which is all pretty interesting, and it suggests that sweetheart murders could actually be linked to all of these different people, and that the Gallegos, and that basically what I'm saying is that the Gallegos are in a way linked to this underground criminal group with people like Philip Arthur Thompson who practice Satanism. In fact, Philip Arthur Thompson is allegedly the high priest of a satanic group in Fresno, and I haven't been able to confirm that, but the fact that Valerie McDonald saw him doing satanic rituals in the apartment would certainly support that. And it's just interesting that, that Kippy Vaught, Kippy Vaught was killed by Gerald and Charlene Gallego, and the Gallegos are in a way connected to these other criminals who have these satanic and drug and intelligence connections. And the final note that I want to make about Philip Arthur Thompson is that he himself is actually linked to Mather Air Force Base in another way. Back in 1975, there were these weapons thefts happening at Mather Air Force Base. A group of people were stealing weapons from the base, and Philip Arthur Thompson was involved in this, but he was not indicted for it. And there was a witness who was about to testify at the trial named Ronald E. Winter, and Ronald E. Winter was murdered by Philip Arthur Thompson. So it seems extraordinarily likely that that was an intentional hit, that he murdered someone who was about to testify against his crimes at Mather, and it's just interesting that the gun running and drug smuggling at Mather actually has a link to Philip Arthur Thompson as well.
That is really interesting, yeah.
And finally, Philip Arthur Thompson has been a suspect in the Zodiac murders as well, which is a whole nother rabbit hole, and we don't have to get into that right now. Just wanted to throw that in there too. But basically, what I'm trying to say for the whole Golden State Killer case, there are a lot of criminals in California. It's kind of insane how many serial killings they were, and there are all sorts of connections between the two, and it seems extraordinarily likely to me that you can't separate them into lone nuts who have nothing to do with each other, that they're really this underground enterprise that they're all part of, and this really supports that idea.
Definitely, we share that with each other, definitely.
Right, so now we can get into the thing that you wanted to talk about, the bad forensics, like the proven cases where these serial killers were evidently framed for with faulty evidence that should not have stood up in court. And the two biggest examples of this that I can see are with the Bobby Joe Long case and the Ted Bundy case. So, first of all, I mean, you've never done a video on Bobby Joe Long, have you? I mean, you have some footage of him in the Serial Killer Conspiracies video, but did you ever do a full video on him yet?
No, I've read Dave McGowan's chapter on Bobby Long very much, but no, I don't know about the video. Probably will do it, but I don't know. Didn't make any plans yet.
All right. Well, I mean, just to give an overview of the Bobby Joe Long murders, it really appears that nearly all of his murders, at least the vast majority of them, were politically motivated and had something to do with prostitution. Many of his victims, his official murder victims, were prostitutes, and they weren't just and not just prostitutes. They were prostitutes who had gotten involved in disputes with their pimp immediately before the murders. And the fact that this pattern is repeated over and over again, it really strains belief that Bobby Joe Long was killing all these people, and that there was no motive. There was no more significant motive behind these murders. I mean, for example, take the case of Lena Long, who was she had basically formerly been in Los Angeles, and she had a supposed boyfriend who seemed a lot more like her pimp, essentially. While she was in Los Angeles, she danced at a bunch of nightclubs, including one of the nightclubs that was owned by Eddie Nash. Are you familiar with that name, the guy who was involved in the Wonderland murders?
Yes, I am. Right.
So, yeah, Lena Long danced at his club, and she later ends up going to Tampa, and at the same time that she did it, one of her other friends in Los Angeles also left for Tampa. And they supposedly went there to pursue a film career. But, I mean, as McGowan points out in his book, normally you would be going to Los Angeles to pursue a film career. You wouldn't be leaving Los Angeles for that purpose. But the types of films that were actually being made in Tampa at the time were not ordinary films. They were snuff films. They were recruiting women to model nude and be involved in these films where they would, injure or even kill each other. So that's the type of activity that was going on in Tampa, and Lena Long was moving from LA to Tampa at the time to do that, well, presumably to do that, and she basically near the end of her life, right before she was killed, she was actually raising money to get out of town. She evidently did not want to be there anymore, so she was probably having some reservations about what she was doing, and it's likely that her boyfriend was in fact forcing her into what she was doing. She was trying to get out of town, but she never made it. She was killed, and her boyfriend didn't even report her disappearance until some friend of theirs, said, "If you don't do it, we're going to." So her boyfriend/pimp didn't want to report her disappearance, and she was trying to leave. Makes it, you would think that he would be a prime suspect in that disappearance, but it just gets pinned on Bobby Joe Long. And if you look at other cases pinned on Bobby Joe Long, the same thing pretty much happens. Another one of the victims, Michelle Sims, had also just come from Southern California to Tampa, and she was also talking about planning to do modeling work, so she was likely involved in the same sort of situation. Elizabeth Loudenbach she actually tried to tell people she actually tried to leave a warning note telling people, like, if I'm killed, here's who you should investigate. And the person who she named, she named two people. I think she named a police and DEA informant in her note and talked about his vehicle. And she also talked about another man who she was afraid of. And both of these men were interrogated and they failed polygraphs. But the police cleared them anyway, and Bobby Joe Long took the rap for that murder too. And then another victim of Bobby Joe Long, Chanel Devon Williams, was once again forced into prostitution and was trying to escape from her pimp. And then Kimberly Hops, similarly, she disappeared after having a fight with her pimp, who was also masquerading, I guess, as her boyfriend. And just like with the Lena Long case, he waited for many days before even reporting her missing. So, I mean, just apply some common sense, and it certainly seems that there's an obvious pattern to these murders. I mean, probably a majority of Bobby Joe Long's victims are prostitutes who are trying to leave their pimps and are implicating some other men in their lives who are giving them a hard time, and they end up dead, and no one really cares about this prostitution connection. They just pin it on this lone serial killer. And the case against Bobby Joe Long is actually pretty shaky, and what happened to him in the criminal justice system is almost comical. I mean, it's one of the most ridiculous cases of manufactured evidence, and it's kind of funny in a way to read about it in McGowan's book, or it would be funny if we weren't talking about actual people's lives at stake. And first of all, the only real evidence against Bobby Joe Long was a confession that he made, an illegal confession that the police gathered, because he was being interrogated and he asked for a lawyer, and the police just ignored him and steamrolled ahead, and they got him to confess to the crimes, even though he had asked for an attorney and the interrogation should have ended. And the other major thing was fiber evidence. And the fiber evidence is the really shaky part of the crimes, really shaky part of the evidence. And there's a particular reason that even McGowan didn't pick up on at this point. The FBI was the agency in charge of the fiber analysis. And the FBI had this esteemed, critically acclaimed guy working for them who did fiber analysis, Special Agent Michael Malone. And Michael Malone used to be, the top class guy. He was really renowned within the FBI. But eventually, allegations started to come out that Michael Malone was pretty much fabricating evidence to get positive matches that favored the prosecution, even when there was no evidence to support it. So, I'll just read from this article quickly. It says, all right, and in time, with all the glory Malone achieved came whispers that turned to murmurs and then a steady buzz. Mike Malone was sloppy. He was a government shill. He stretched the truth, maybe even made things up. And ultimately, when the DOJ started to review the case, they found that Malone in many cases, Malone lied about the fiber matches. He said that things matched when they actually didn't. Tons of cases, probably hundreds of cases that were analyzed by Michael Malone were potentially tainted by him towing the prosecution line and just fabricating all this evidence. And it's kind of incredible that this only came out now. It only came out around the turn of the 21st century, and a lot of people didn't pick up on it. But there are so many high-profile cases that Michael Malone handled. Like, Have you ever heard of the Jeffrey McDonald case, for example?
Yeah, I actually saw 48 Hours ago Great Crimes and Trials of that case, so I'm really, yeah, I know.
Yeah, and what do you think of that? Do you think that there's a chance that Jeffrey McDonald was in fact framed, set up by a satanic group?
I think, yeah, the Jeffrey McDonald case is just a case that it's almost like the JFK case.
Yeah, I mean, it's
there's so much misinformation, disinformation, and false theories and accurate evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I've been meaning to get Errol Morris's book about it, A Wilderness of Error, to try to see what the truth might actually be in that case. And, I mean, you know that Ted Gunderson was also involved in that, and he's obviously a very controversial figure in all of these Satanism investigations. So, I don't know that all the details behind the Jeffrey McDonald case, but I do know that, you know, that case was one of the cases that was handled by Michael Malone. And when they were appealing Jeffrey McDonald's conviction, they actually used that as a point for why it should be given another look or overturned. But in any case, one of the investigations handled by Michael Malone was in fact Bobby Joe Long. So you have this FBI agent who is known to fabricate evidence about fiber matches, who was involved in the fiber analysis, and pretty much most of the state's case against Bobby Joe Long hinges on these fibers, which are analyzed by this guy who is known to fabricate evidence. And I think that's a really significant part of the Bobby Joe Long case that very few people are looking at. In fact, according to one article I found, it's actually, this article actually questions whether any of the fiber matches in Bobby Joe Long's case are authentic. It literally says the fibers were different colors, and according to the Justice Department review, they might have come from different sources. So if that's true, it means that the case against Bobby Joe Long, a major piece of evidence is pretty much evaporates right then and there. So I think that was a very, very interesting discovery to make about the case, and it shows, I guess, once again, shows that Dave McGowan in many ways has a lot of good foresight in these cases, is very prescient, and even when he doesn't have all the information, he's on the right track, and he often can predict these kinds of developments, like the forensic evidence being shown to be a fabrication. Now, the other stuff that happened with Bobby Joe Long is also kind of interesting. He went on this weird odyssey through the Florida Supreme Court, the Florida judicial system. He was convicted originally. He was appealing his case. He went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court tossed out a lot of the evidence that had been used against him. They tossed out the confession, which was gotten illegally by police because they didn't stop when he asked for a lawyer, and they forced him to have another trial. And they immediately scheduled another trial, and he was convicted very shortly thereafter. He appealed again. Well, so in this new trial, because they couldn't use the confession, they decided to take TV footage of him, heavily edit the footage, and supposedly present that as his confession. And then then he got convicted again. So he appealed again, and this time the Florida Supreme Court threw out the case again, basically saying that you can't use this as a confession, and also you barely even focused on the actual murders that you're charging him with. You just spent multiple days talking about murders he hadn't even been charged with. The same kind of pattern of prejudicial evidence being inserted into these cases. So Bobby Joe Long, his conviction was thrown out a second time, and then finally they tried him and they convicted him a third time. And I mean, that's what he's been. I don't think his conviction has ever been challenged since then. I don't think that he probably tried to appeal based on the Michael Malone evidence, but it didn't go anywhere, which is unfortunate because it seems like there should have been a more thorough investigation opened up. I'm not saying that Bobby Joe Long was totally innocent. He probably wasn't, but the motives behind these murders need to be fully explored. It doesn't make sense that it was just a lone killer who just happens to kill prostitutes, and for the most part only kill prostitutes who happen to be in disputes with their pimps. it really reeks of a cover-up, and the forensic evidence that the problems with the forensic evidence that Michael Malone analyzed really just confirmed that.
Yeah, I think Bobby Joe Long was one of the ad-classified rapists, and he wasn't the killer. He wasn't the man responsible for the girl's death.
Right.
The death of the girls.
I think his wife even talked about one point. He had Polaroids of a bunch of women who seemed to have been horrifically brutalized by him. I mean, there's little doubt that he was a rapist. He was involved in all these horrible crimes. And the weird thing, he's committing all these rapes in 3 counties in Florida, and he's not committing any murders in any of them. And meanwhile, he's only committing murders in Hillsborough County, where Tampa is, and not committing any things that are just rape. Kind of an interesting parallel, actually, to the EAR ONS case, where you see a bunch of, in this section of the country, the guy is committing a bunch of rapes and not really any murders, or only one possible murder with the Maggiores. And then down in Southern California, he's just committing a bunch of murders. And you would think there would be a more commonality between the two, but it really just is like in 2 different locations you see 2 entirely distinct MOs. And I guess that's something that shows up in serial killer cases a lot. So it's just interesting to see how, Bobby Joe Long also said at one point, like, I talked, but I didn't talk about my friends from other parts of the country, sort of implying that other people helped him out in the murders. So it's not even entirely clear, like, even he alludes to accomplices while still incriminating himself in the murders. I think I am inclined to agree with you that he may not have been committing any of the murders, and he was framed for that. But certainly, the evidence against him is not convincing at all. I mean, you have confessions that were manufactured or not even real law enforcement interrogations. You have fiber evidence by this guy, by this FBI agent who is totally untrustworthy, and that's basically the totality of the evidence. So I think the Bobby Joe Long case stands out as one of the most corrupt serial killer cases just because of how thin the case was against him. And of course, there's the interesting connection of him, him being the cousin of Henry Lee Lucas. And I'm actually, for a while, I was wondering if there's a possibility that Bobby Joe Long himself was involved in the Hand of Death as well. But that's really just speculation. I don't have much to back that up.
Yeah, I can also recall seeing a documentary where his wife and his children are making statements about it, are being interviewed.
Talking about the rape that he committed, or?
No, just talking about him as a general guy, as a father and a husband.
All right, yeah. I mean, tons of these people. I mean, it's always interesting to talk about how these people, they don't show any signs of, they fit in normally with the community, and yet they have this dark side to them, and that to many of us calls forth the possibility of multiple personality situation. With Gacy, for example, if he seems to be this, a lot of people just viewed him as this genuine guy, and yet he obviously has a dark sadistic side of a rapist and a murderer of at least some people. And yeah, it's just interesting to see all these double-sided people. And Bobby Joe Long, he has a military background. He was in the School of the Americas. He was basically in the military group that was involved in death squads and drug trafficking in South and Central America. So he was certainly in a prime position to be subjected to this kind of trauma-based mind control programming.
Yeah, didn't he also, while being unemployed, having a ski trip or a diving trip for like $9,000?
Yeah, it was. He moved to California, moved to Southern California, and what's interesting is that he moved there at the same exact time that Henry Lee Lucas, his cousin, was in Southern California for, I guess, Hand of Death business, and that was what made me wonder if Bobby Joe Long himself was involved in the Hand of Death in some way. as well as the fact that, yes, as you pointed out, he signed up for diving lessons. Now, for a while, I was trying to investigate the background of the Hand of Death and trying to figure out who these other people were, how much of the story can be corroborated. Because a lot of people don't want to believe words that come out of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole's mouth, especially because they've clearly lied about so much. Like, they've clearly confessed to all sorts of crimes they didn't commit, even though they most likely have committed many real crimes. So, I was trying to search for the person who recruited them into the cult in the first place. And according to the Hand of Death book, which I did get a copy of a few months ago, the person who recruited them into the cult was named Don, I don't know how you pronounce it, it's Don Metric or Don Meteric. The last name is spelled Meteric. So anyway, Don Metric is the name that they gave of the cult recruiter who owned this warehouse in Miami, and he was the person who Henry and Otis went to for like the initial induction into the cult ceremony. Now, the problem is that I could not, when I searched the name Don Metric, I could not find really any evidence that he was a real person. But I did find one weird post on the Google, on some kind of message board where the person claimed that Don Metric was a diving instructor in Rockford, Illinois, and that he basically played sadistic and cruel jokes on his students, like giving them faulty tanks and regulators, putting chum in the tanks, essentially like doing all sorts of dangerous sadistic jokes on his students at the diving school. So if this is the real, so I could never confirm this, but if Don Metric, if the person who recruited Henry and Otis into the cult was a diving instructor, it seemed a bit interesting to think that Bobby Joe Long was in California taking diving lessons, and it just made me wonder if there's a connection there.
Please tell us about the book Hand of Death from Max Call and about possible also association with Dahmer, Toole, and Lucas.
Oh, sure, yeah, that was one of the most interesting things I came across. Now, first of all, what I want to point out is I was reading the introduction of the Hand of Death book, and they actually said that all names in here are fake except for Henry, Otis, and I think Sister Clemmy Schroeder as well. So most of the names in the book turned out to be fake, so the Don Metric might not even be a real name. And in that case, the stuff about the diving school may not be true, but it also means that if we get into the FBI files of the Hand of Death, like there were the interrogations of Lucas and Toole, we might be able to find out the real name of the cult recruiter. But anyway, getting into what you said, for a while there's been controversy over whether who abducted Adam Walsh, and for a while, Otis Toole confessed to it, and then he unconfessed to it, and then he allegedly made a confession on his deathbed in 1996. And at the same time, people pretty much accepted this verdict for a while, including John Walsh. But then around 2006, Arthur J. Harris did his own research and looked at the police documents and started to think, well, actually, a lot of the evidence matches Jeffrey Dahmer much better. Like the van, for example, like the blue van that Dahmer owned matched the description of a van that was seen at the site of the abduction. And I think you've talked about this before, right? You think that Dahmer is a better suspect in the abduction than Toole.
Far more better.
Yeah. So that alone, that was interesting to me. But in any case, while doing research into the Hand of Death, I just happened to stumble across Arthur J. Harris's book about the Adam Walsh abduction. And the key selling point of his book, first of all, is not just that they got the wrong killer, they also got the wrong body. And the body really was only a head. The head that was identified as Adam Walsh might not have even been Adam Walsh in the first place. And according to Arthur J. Harris, allegedly he was contacted by somebody who claimed that they were Adam Walsh, that they grew up, that they, basically what happened was, this guy claimed that he was abducted, he was abused, well, he was molested for a while, then he woke up, he pretty much lost his memory of his life, and he was adopted by a Hispanic family. And eventually he began to remember his original life, that he was Adam Walsh, and he tried to contact John Walsh. He didn't get a success. I think they tried to get a DNA test done, but John Walsh refused. And so he was in contact with Arthur J. Harris, and Arthur J. Harris was able to dig out some witnesses who knew Adam Walsh as a kid, and confirmed that this person who claimed to be Adam Walsh knew about childhood memories that Adam Walsh had with this friend. And then he also found some people who had been with Jeffrey Dahmer in West Germany, and confirmed that this guy claiming to be Adam Walsh, his description of Jeffrey Dahmer matched the real Jeffrey Dahmer. So this adult person claiming to be Adam Walsh, and in Arthur J. Harris's book, he basically called them AW. Like, he just gave the initials AW to refer to this man. So just based on what Arthur J. Harris has said there, and the fact that apparently there's a lot of problems with the dental match between Adam Walsh and the head that was said to be Adam Walsh, it seems very plausible that this AW person is actually Adam Walsh, that Adam Walsh didn't die, wasn't murdered, but he was abducted and raped, and then subsequently lost his memory for a while and grew up in a different family.
Could you please tell us about the statement that AW made when he was being sexually assaulted by Dahmer in a building, and there was a SWAT team?
SWAT? I don't remember the specific thing about a SWAT team, but there was some strange stuff about what he said regarding what happened in his abduction. He brought up some other killers, and even suggested a link to the Franklin scandal, which is even weirder than that. So, according to AW, he was abducted by Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, no doubt about that. He's adamant that Jeffrey Dahmer is the one who took him. But they drove him to some location, like some abandoned apartment. Well, some apartment that was apparently used for the purpose of human trafficking. And as soon as they arrived at the apartment, he saw Otis Toole. So it's interesting that even though AW is supporting the theory that Jeffrey Dahmer was the abductor of Adam Walsh, he also brings Otis Toole into it as well. So what it implies is that Otis Toole and Jeffrey Dahmer were connected to each other, and they were both involved in the same kind of activities together in South Florida. And now here's one sort of weird statement that I have found is that AW for some reason also claimed that Ted Bundy was at the apartment, and Ted Bundy could not have been at the apartment. He was in prison at the time, although he was in Florida. So I don't know what to make of that, and it's possible that it means that his memory is not as accurate as one might think. But it is nevertheless interesting that he implicates both Jeffrey Dahmer and Otis Toole as being involved in this. Dahmer being the abductor, Otis Toole being at the apartment once they get there. And in the apartment there were a bunch of children, young children who were held there, like probably a dozen children who were held captive there. Almost all of them were boys, a couple were girls. And they were being held there in advance of being sold into what he called the flesh market. In other words, human trafficking. And obviously, I'm sure you probably heard before that Miami is a huge hub for human trafficking. It makes sense. It means the huge hub for all of these criminal enterprises, drugs. So it's very curious that AW, who clearly, he is almost certainly Adam Walsh, and he recognized Jeffrey Dahmer. He also places Otis Toole at this apartment too. And he says that Dahmer and Toole he implies that Dahmer and Toole were essentially kidnapping kids for human trafficking. So that's a fascinating connection there. And just one other thing that I want to bring up about AW's statement, and this is really the weirdest thing of all. According to AW, while AW was being tortured in Miami by Toole and Dahmer, there was someone else who was there, basically the boss of Dahmer and Toole. And the man's first name was Larry. He has a federal criminal record, and he's alleged to have run a pedophile ring. Now, does that sound familiar to you in any way?
John D. Norman?
Well, first name Larry.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
First name Larry, federal criminal record.
Larry Eiler?
Well, it's actually, I would say, Larry King of the Franklin scandal.
Oh, yeah.
So that connection is really stunning to me. Like, basically, AW says that Dahmer and Toole, while they were torturing these kids who were about to be sold into human trafficking, they had a boss, and that boss was Larry King of the Franklin scandal. And this was in 1981, which is right as the Franklin scandal is beginning to kick into high gear. So basically, AW, he bridges a lot of these cases together into one thing. He says that Toole and Dahmer are working together in this abduction scenario, and that Larry King is involved too. So, have you gotten Arthur J. Harris's book? Because all this information is really, really startling and really interesting.
I think he published 3 books, and I only read 1. Or 2.
Yeah,
or 2 maybe.
Yeah, if you get a chance, you should definitely check it out. But anyway, that's just the beginning of what I want to talk about in that regard, because when Arthur J. Harris heard this from AW about Toole and Dahmer being together, he didn't just take it at face value. He was wondering if there was actually a way to corroborate the fact that the claim that both of them were together on the day of Adam Walsh's abduction. And first of all, it's proven that Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole and Jeffrey Dahmer were all in Miami at the same time in July 1981. Or around that time. So first of all, isn't it such a stunning coincidence that all 3 of these major serial killers are in the same place at the same time? I found that very interesting. And what makes it more interesting is that there's a passage in the Hand of Death book where Henry Lee Lucas talks about a friend of Otis Toole who sounds pretty much exactly like Jeffrey Dahmer in an interesting way. The exact quote is, "Otis was traveling with an effeminate friend, but the man's pale blue eyes were cold as ice." So, and then Arthur J. Harris talked to a bunch of people who knew Dahmer, and they all pretty much said that yes, the pale blue eyes that were as cold as ice, that's an accurate description. And according to people who knew Jeffrey Dahmer, they also said that in private, when he was comfortable with friends of his, that he had a more effeminate manner. So the description given by Henry Lee Lucas of Otis's friend is a good match for Jeffrey Dahmer, and this description was given in 1985 or earlier than that, which is well before Jeffrey Dahmer was well known in any way at all, like before his crime spree started. So that is one piece of confirmation that seems to indicate that maybe Otis Toole actually did know Dahmer, that they were both involved in the same group, because Otis's friend, who's described in that way that matches Jeffrey Dahmer, they were at this bar that was known to be a hangout for Hand of Death cult members. So what that would imply is that Otis's friend, whoever that was also a member of the Hand of Death. And if it's Dahmer, it would mean that Dahmer was a member of the Hand of Death. And honestly, if you look at Dahmer's trajectory, it wouldn't be surprising, would it? First of all, we know that he was involved in Satanism from a young age, right? He did a seance when he was in high school. He didn't he have a satanic altar when the police arrested him in Milwaukee?
Yeah. He also had a pet cemetery, which unbelievably his parents knew, I think.
Right. So he was clearly involved in Satanism for a while. So he would certainly fit into the. He would definitely fit into the hand of death very well. And he was in Miami shortly after he came back from the Army, and I would say that really follows the trajectory of many serial killers. We see, they go to the Army, something happens to them, and they come back and they join a satanic cult or other killing group, and then their serial killing spree begins soon after that. Like, for example, with David Berkowitz.
Yep.
He's in the Army. He's dosed with LSD in the special sort of like program for people who are profiled, and he comes back to New York, and he shortly thereafter gets brought into the Process Church cult. Or Henry Lee Lucas is in prison, and he gets subjected to electroshock while he's in the mental ward. And soon after he leaves the prison, he ends up joining the Hand of Death. Well, what about Dahmer? He's in the military, he seemingly is profiled, and then he goes to Miami, and there's some evidence that he ends up falling in with Otis Toole and that whole crowd. So it actually makes quite a lot of sense that Dahmer and Toole might have been involved in the same cult with each other. And Arthur J. Harris even found another witness who contacted him in 2014. The witness was named Charles Cetera, who claimed that when he was a young kid at the Hollywood Mall, on the same day that Adam Walsh was kidnapped, he actually saw both Dahmer and Toole working together in the abduction. So there's even an independent witness there who confirms that they were working together. So, yeah, I mean, it was interesting when you pointed out that Joel Rifkin was a gardener for the estate of Sophia Casey. But the thing that I primarily focused on was reading the crime library overview of the case. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me while reading it. So, first of all, one of the victims, and I don't have much to say on this because I only have a couple anomalies that I pointed out, but they're definitely worthy of further investigation. So, to start with, one of his victims was a prostitute and a drug addict, and according to the official story, so she ends up being killed by somebody, clearly, and she ends up being clubbed and then strangled manually, and then wrapped up in plastic, put in a box, and then dumped in the Hudson River. So they find her body, and they just say that she died of a drug overdose. And I was reading that, and I thought, what the hell? How do you claim that somebody who is found wrapped in plastic inside a cardboard box in the river with signs of being beaten and strangled died of a drug overdose? I mean, how did a coroner even come to that conclusion? It makes no sense. I mean, what do you think of that?
No, that's totally ridiculous, totally.
Yeah, and what I thought of that was the only reason I can think of for such an outrageous conclusion is that it was a murder committed by somebody who was wealthy and powerful. And at the time, this person, some guy who's wealthy and powerful meets a prostitute. The prostitute ends up getting murdered, and they are forced to, and at the time they have to cover it up as an accidental death, because at the time they don't realize that they're going to eventually, have a serial killer to pin it on. At the time, it's just like, well, we can't let this be investigated, or it's going to potentially incriminate this high-level politician. So there's some pressure exerted on the coroner to say that it was a drug overdose. I mean, honestly, I can't think of any other explanation for such a ridiculous ruling by the medical examiner. It really just makes no sense otherwise. It seemed like there was someone tying their hands, forcing them to make this proclamation. So aside from that, which I think is really anomalous and needs to be looked at further, the woman's name is Barbara Jacobs, who was killed and then ruled a drug overdose. When something that I just found curious, when Joel Rifkin was dumping the body of another one of his victims, the police, basically a patrolman drove up to him and they confronted him with illegal dumping into the river. But somehow Joel was able to persuade them that he was just collecting junk and they didn't do anything. Even so, he had just dumped the body. The police find him and they nearly look into the fact that he was illegally dumping stuff, but he's able to convince them that he wasn't doing anything wrong and they just let him go with a warning. I found that kind of strange. The next major thing to get into is just the fact that the interrogation of Joel Rifkin is just so irregular. It matches, in a way, it's very similar to what we were talking about with Bobby Joe Long. Like, Joel Rifkin is brought in for interrogation. The police start interrogating him. They do so for 8 hours, and yet they never record any of the interrogation. So, according to Joel Rifkin, he asked for a lawyer over a dozen times, and the police just say, no, you can't speak until you give us one more homicide. So there's no recording to validate what happened in the room, and Joel Rifkin claims that his rights were flagrantly violated by the police, and they were just trying to pile on prostitute murders and force him to confess to them, and they wouldn't let him go until he confessed all these murders. And then they just write down a transcript that says, yup, he confessed all these murders and he didn't want a lawyer. So that's just a completely outrageous perversion of justice to interrogate someone, have no proof of what happened in the interrogation, and just write down, yup, he confessed. And in a way, it sort of reminds me of what happened with Bundy, right? You know how Bundy supposedly made all these incriminating statements on tape, and yet none of those statements could be heard. The police just had to testify that he made those statements.
Yeah.
Yeah, so same thing kind of happened in the Joel Rifkin case here, but to an even larger extent, where there was literally no record of the interrogation and simply relied on the police's word as his confession, and it could not be independently verified. Now, actually, this just gets a bit, and I'm going to take a brief detour here into a more of a systemic issue, which is that, did you know that the FBI's policy, maybe they changed it recently, but at least for a while, the FBI's policy was that they would not record interviews. The FBI agents just wrote down their own account of an interview with someone.
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I found that, and I was stunned that that's actually what happened. That the FBI agents can pretty much get away with writing down whatever they want in the report, and there is no independent record to challenge them.
It is a federal matter.
Yeah. It's really stunning that it actually has gone on this long. And when you look at something like the Franklin case, where there are all these supposedly incriminating statements that people like Alicia Owen and Troy Bonner and Danny King are making to the FBI, and yet they testify, no, I didn't make any of these statements. And the sad truth is, when most jurors are evaluating the witness, like people on the witness stand, they're going to believe what the FBI agent says, but you can't prove what the FBI agent even wrote down as the truth. And that same thing happened in the Joel Rifkin case, where he has a very credible claim that his rights were violated, but they don't care. The courts didn't do anything about it. They rejected his claim that there was an illegal interrogation, even though I would argue that it was made illegal by virtue of the fact that it couldn't be proven that he was told his rights and given his rights to a lawyer. So there's just so much that's really troubling about the case. And the fact that, according to Rifkin, the police were pretty much telling him, no, you have to give us one more homicide. It makes me think that Joel Rifkin may well have been guilty of some of the murders that were pinned on him, but he certainly was not guilty of all the murders. Yeah. And my opinion, my personal theory of the case, and it really is just a hunch, but based on some of this evidence, is that Joel Rifkin was a prostitute killer, but it was also convenient to attach other murders that had been committed by quite likely prominent men in the New York area. So that's sort of evidenced by the fact that one of the victims of Joel Rifkin had this absolutely absurd autopsy ruling. It seems like, victims of high-profile politicians or business elites in New York ended up killing prostitutes, and Joel Rifkin was forced to take the rap for all of that.
What do you think of these two things? Number one, he was living with his mother, right?
Yeah, he was.
And also, he made use of his mother's car.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing, and I know that in other cases too, it's been brought up. Some serial killers have unusually, I guess, close bonds with their mothers. Like Angelo Buono never lived. He was always living very close to his mother. He never really moved away, and
it's more like the question: if he committed those murders, how? Yeah, do that in where your mom is living and in the same house and using her car to transport body parts and bodies.
Right. I mean, first of all, it's certainly possible that when you have this link, this enduring link, that there could be some kind of darker situation going on in the family. But you are right that
it is really sketchy.
It often strains belief that if someone could commit these crimes and live in the house and commit all these crimes, live in the house, and the other people living with them are none the wiser. They don't even know that it's happened. I do find that kind of skeptical, and I wonder if the mother knew more than she was saying.
Also with the wife of Gary Ridgway, the Riverman. Right.
And just to talk about Gary Ridgway for a second, I ended up actually finding a video where there's this woman who claimed that she was a victim of Gary Ridgway and that she had been horribly mistreated by the police who didn't really care about her saying that she was a victim. And she also said in her video that there was another man in the car besides Gary Ridgway while she was being raped. The video is on the CavDef wiki, so I mean, after this, you should definitely find it and watch it. It was a pretty interesting thing to see there. And of course, there are other rumors that Ridgway had connections to the Picton's farm, Piggy Palace, but unfortunately, all that's just rumors too. But anyway, I mean, first of all, the Gary Ridgway case, there were also some weird discrepancies there, like with the way that the criminal justice system treated him. I mean, the fact that what I've seen, and this was from Wikipedia, I'm not totally sure if this was verified or not, but Gary Ridgway, oh, and by the way, Joel Rifkin apparently had a book about the Green River Killer in his house, in his possession. This was before Ridgway had been caught, but yeah, he had a book about the Green River Killer.
Did you know that Jeffrey Dahmer also had the books Company for Killing about Dennis Nilsen and also Free to Kill about Larry Eiler?
Yeah. We see this a lot too, and I think didn't Karla Homolka have books like The Ultimate Evil?
Yeah, and Michelle Remembers.
Yeah. It seems a lot of these serial killers are in a way inspired, or maybe even if we're talking about mind control, triggered by seeing what other killers in the past have done. And it certainly does support the idea that there is a larger network of these people involved together. Now, for Gary Ridgway, he was viewed as a suspect all the way back in 1984. He was interrogated with a polygraph, and he allegedly, according to Wikipedia, he allegedly passed the polygraph, but it was later found when they examined the polygraph that he had really failed the polygraph. Like he should not have been cleared as a suspect. He should have actually failed the polygraph and been treated as an even bigger, like more likely suspect than before. So that just got me thinking, why exactly did he fail the polygraph when he should have? Why did he pass the polygraph when he should have failed? And it kind of reminds me of two things. First of all, what happened in the JFK assassination with Jack Ruby. You know that Jack Ruby was, I mean, he was interrogated with a polygraph, and he supposedly said, yep, I was not involved in any conspiracy. I just did this because I care so much about Jackie Kennedy, even though I hate her husband's brother who's prosecuting organized crime, and I just did this to spare her the awful experience of having a trial. And so he supposedly passes the polygraph test saying that there was no conspiracy. But it turned out that the polygraph test was conducted in such an irresponsible and outright deceptive manner. It was designed to obscure the fact that he was, you know, clearly guilty and actually failing the polygraph. Like they ran the polygraph test for way longer than they should have, because at a certain point, if you just take a polygraph for too long, you don't even feel the same stress about lying anymore, and it becomes natural to you. And they also turned down the sensitivity on many of the indicators. Like, one of the indicators is known as galvanic skin response, which is like if you're like regards like sweating and blood flow, and you're supposed to turn it up and make it more sensitive over time, but they actually were turning Jack Ruby's GSR down over time. So in the case of Jack Ruby, there was clearly a corrupt polygraph that made it seem as if he was telling the truth about there being no conspiracy, even though there clearly, obviously, was a conspiracy that he was part of. And that just made me think about Gary Ridgway and whether his polygraph was similarly manipulated to try to obscure his guilt. So, aside from that, there's actually, interestingly enough, in the Oakland County child killer case, there's also something similar that happened there, where a prime suspect in the case, supposedly, they clearly should have failed their polygraph, but they were cleared originally, and then later an examination found that the polygraph was conducted incorrectly. So there might be as many as 3 cases, Jack Ruby, Gary Ridgway, and the Oakland County child killer, where this happened. And that's a curious pattern all on its own. And if you want, we can get into the Oakland County child killer case, but first I just wanted to bring up one other thing about Ted Bundy, because we had planned to talk about that originally before getting into some of the other cases. Is that okay?
Yeah, please. Sure.
So I just wanted to bring up, in the case of Ted Bundy, where for the Chi Omega sorority house murders, one of the biggest pieces of evidence there was the bite marks that were supposedly left on the buttocks of one of the victims, and these bite marks allegedly matched Ted Bundy's teeth perfectly. But according to Joe Alloy, who was the investigator for the public defender's office in Florida, and he was with Bundy for a time, and like Bundy was informed that he was about to be forced to submit to a cast of his teeth, and Bundy immediately, as soon as he heard this, he basically, I think he took some kind of sharp object, and he intentionally chipped his tooth with this object, and then he said, all right, let them figure that out. And so he chipped his tooth before the impressions of his teeth were made. And then allegedly, the impressions made of his teeth were said to be a perfect match for the bite marks left on the victims. But how can that possibly be? Because the bite marks were made when Bundy's tooth had not yet been chipped.
Yep, I read that, yeah. I did include it in my video series, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I mean, McGowan talks about this in his book, but I actually found the exact source. I found a Tallahassee Magazine article talking about this that interviewed Joe Alloy, and he talks about how he literally saw Bundy doing this. And I would say that it pretty much shows how fraudulent the evidence was, that the fact that it matched a chipped tooth that Bundy got after the Chi Omega murders pretty much proves that the bite marks were not real, that they just took an impression of his teeth and used them to bite the victims, and that's how they got the supposed bite mark evidence. And
at the crime scene, they didn't even did a proper medical examination. So they didn't have a good camera to shoot it. They did it with normal cameras.
Yeah, that was the weird thing too. That the medical examiner's camera was not able to be used. So they had to bring in a different camera. So there was no real chain of custody that these were actually authentic photos taken at the crime scene by the medical examiner. So, and I guess, these supposed camera malfunctions are always interesting because I investigated and I talked about this on one of the Opperman episodes I did, the case of Ray Lemmy, the alleged suicide of Ray Lemmy. I don't know if you are vaguely familiar with that case.
No.
Well, yeah, just like he was investigating all sorts of crimes in Valdosta, Georgia, relating to the importation of illegal immigrants, election fraud, political corruption, the John Cooey, sex trafficking in Valdosta, which relates to the John Cooey case, which sort of indirectly relates to John Walsh in a roundabout type of way. But yeah, Ray Lemmy he appears to have been suicided, and there was a claim that there were no usable crime scene photos, so there would be no photos submitted with the report. And then eventually somebody found these crime scene photos did in fact exist, that apparently the Valdosta Police Department tried to erase them from their memory card, but they were able to recover them, and then afterwards they pretty much admitted that the photos were real, and the camera had not, the photos were real, even though the report claimed the camera malfunctioned, and they tried to claim, we recovered the photos with special software, but there's really no evidence of that. So the whole thing about convenient camera malfunctions is also a parallel that we see in these kinds of cases where they need to cover up or hide something or fabricate evidence.
Yeah.
So anyway, where do you want to go to next? I mean, we've covered a lot. We've covered most of the stuff already. Just a few. I mean, do you want to talk about Johnny Gosch or Oakland County?
Oakland County.
All right, sure. So, and I guess at the end I can, because after that there will only be the Johnny Gosch stuff left to talk about, and I can bring that up a bit. We don't need to get into too much detail, but there are some interesting things there. With the Oakland County child killings, and I've alluded to this a bit before, that there's clearly some kind of sex ring connection to it. The Oakland County child killings were, basically, in the mid-'70s, there were a couple children that were abducted, and they were found multiple days later having been murdered. But the weirdest thing about it is that these children were not killed immediately. They were kept for multiple days before they were being murdered, and in some cases their clothes were actually scrubbed clean. So that was a very weird thing about the case. It led to them, the Oakland County child killer was known as the babysitter because it would keep these children in captivity for long periods of time. It would feed them. It would sometimes, of course, wash their clothes before murdering them. So there's a lot of, the weird thing about the Oakland County child killer case is that there have been a bunch of suspects that were brought up, and they're all, the thing is, the evidence implicating any one suspect is not that substantial. There've been, and yet it seems that they've all been sort of in cahoots with each other in this one large pedophile ring. So first of all, we have the person who I was talking about earlier, the one who was said to have passed the polygraph, even though they should have failed the polygraph. And that person's name was Chris Busch, spelled B-U-S-C-H. So Chris Busch was actually kind of a prominent guy in Oakland County, which is just one county over from Detroit in Michigan. He was the son of a General Motors executive. And I mean, yeah, auto industry is very big in Michigan, so he was kind of he was from a somewhat wealthy family there, and he was a pedophile. He was involved in molesting all sorts of boys, and he was treated as a suspect in the case. He was interrogated. He was most likely involved, but they never really pursued him, in part because of this polygraph. And it was a lot later that they finally found out, like the family of one of the victims, Timmy King, was really fighting hard to uncover what happened in the case, and they happened to learn that this polygraph examination had been conducted. If they hadn't learned about it, they might not have even ever found out the name Chris Bush in the first place, but they learned about it, and as a result, they were able to start investigating. And Chris Bush has this curious... Chris Bush was... he allegedly committed suicide right as the Oakland County child killings were coming to an end. I personally feel it's more likely that he was suicided, and there are a couple of weird things about that. First of all, there was a drawing in his house that looked a lot like one of the victims, Mark Stebbins, which people remarked on. Some of the investigators remarked on. The investigative files of the suicide case for Chris Bush were destroyed for unexplained reasons, which is always great when evidence is just tossed out by law enforcement. And the other thing about Chris Bush is that it appears that he was connected to a larger pedophile ring that catered to the wealthy and powerful in Michigan, and this pedophile ring was actually linked to other pedophile rings like the one involving John Norman. So here's the first question. Did you listen to the interview that Ed Opperman did with William Dorsch?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And do you remember him talking about North Fox Island?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, North Fox Island is essentially the location of that pedophile ring. And the people involved in that ring were some very wealthy men, like Francis Sheldon, who was from like an old money family in Michigan, Dyer Grossman, Gerald Richards, all these men who started this thing called Brother Paul's Child Mission. And this was supposedly a nature camp for boys, but as these things go, it was really a front for child prostitution. And they were taking boys. I think they had dozens of boys on this island who were involved in child pornography shoots and also being prostituted out to wealthy and powerful customers. So this pedophile ring is going on in North Fox Island. And according to a Michigan State Police report, Chris Bush had a suitcase full of pornographic photos on North Fox Island, which means he is actually connected to people like Frank Sheldon and Dyer Grossman. So already you have a link between Chris Bush, who should definitely be considered a suspect in the Timmy King abduction, and quite likely also the Mark Stebbins abduction / murder. And then you have a link to North Fox Island, a pedophile ring. Now, at the same time, especially before that, here's one thing I want to point out. First of all, the reason that William Dorsch brought up North Fox Island is because one of the Gacy victims was kind of linked to it. Do you remember that discussion? He was talking about Russell Nelson in Minneapolis, and how Russell Nelson was staying with a Christian minister who was really involved with the gay community, and this Christian minister would actually have some involvement with North Fox Island. Do you remember that part of the interview? No,
but please tell more.
Sure. Now, I did find the name of this Christian minister. His name is Thomas Maurer, spelled Maurer. So Thomas Maurer, he was pretty much, he was a roommate more or less of this guy who was much younger than him, Russell Nelson, and he was allegedly involved in North Fox Island. And I guess it's just interesting to see that connection, because we know, of course, that many of Gacy's victims were most likely killed with purpose because they were somehow linked to sex trafficking operations like the Delta Project. and it makes me wonder if Russell Nelson learned some information that he shouldn't have, and that's why he was targeted to be murdered and disposed of in Gacy's crawl space. But in any case, North Fox Island has this connection. North Fox Island has this connection to Bush, but North Fox Island also has a connection to other pedophile rings during the 1970s. If you read the Chicago Tribune series on people like John Norman and the other child pornography rings that were being exposed around that time, it's pretty clear that all of them are basically networked together with each other. And, you have, groups like John Norman, a group in Tennessee, and North Fox Island are all linked to each other. All of these different groups are pretty much all in business with each other, and that makes sense because, where else are they going to turn? But it's just fascinating to see these connections. So, Chris Bush, who is a suspect who is connected to North Fox Island and is a suspect in the Oakland County child murders, it turns out that he may have actually been seen by a witness speaking to one of the Oakland County child killer victims right before he disappeared. And the weird thing about this is that originally this witness claimed that John Wayne Gacy was the one talking to Timmy King. And did you know that John Wayne Gacy was actually viewed as a suspect in the Oakland County child killings for a while?
No.
Yeah, like this witness, Doug Wilson, says that he saw John Wayne Gacy and a younger man who resembled John Wayne Gacy's accomplice talking to Timmy King right before Timmy King was abducted. It was described as like a father-son type conversation with this young man and Timmy King, and then he saw this older man who looked like John Wayne Gacy sitting in a car. So originally the belief was that it was Gacy and one of his accomplices, and I don't know which accomplice they're talking about. I don't know if they were talking about Rossi, Cram, or Paskey. It could really have been any of them, although Paskey actually seems to fit the description better than anyone else. But what people later pointed out was that Gacy and Chris Bush actually looked kind of similar to each other, and that might imply that Doug Wilson thinks that he saw Gacy, but he actually instead saw Chris Bush with a younger accomplice of his. And talking about these younger accomplices actually gets into a whole other issue of the sort of the missing link in this pedophile group of how these kids were getting abducted. Because aside from the really wealthy, high-class millionaires who ran North Fox Island, and the intermediate, middle-class people like Chris Bush, there are also these a lot lower-class people living in the Cass Corridor area of Detroit, near Detroit, and these people, basically these pedophiles are not really wealthy or powerful, but they're procurers of young boys and girls, and so they have connections to the wealthy and powerful for that purpose. It sort of reminds me of David Berkowitz, for example. Like, how David Berkowitz essentially said that the Process Church was procuring boys for parties at home where wealthy people would participate.
Yeah.
Yeah, including, like, for example, the home of Roy Cohn, who, like, Trump's mentor and, famous mob lawyer. I know that, like Jim Rothstein has talked on the Opperman Report before about how, and at other places before, how Roy Cohn was essentially running a pedophile ring. He ran a pedophile ring that was blackmailing people in New York, and he was actually connected to Craig Spence of the Franklin scandal, which shows that the Franklin ring and Roy Cohn were probably linked to each other too. But anyway, in a parallel to this, people like David Berkowitz were not wealthy and powerful. They were pretty much at the lowest rung of society, and yet, because of the illicit, enterprises that they were part of, drug trafficking or murder for hire or child trafficking, they had some value to these wealthy men in New York. And similarly, these Cass Corridor people had some value to these wealthy men, people like Frank Sheldon, for example. So we had people like Arch Sloan, people like, I think, Ted Lamborghini. Let me pull up some of the names, actually. Yeah. So, right. So there was this person named Richard Lawson, Ted Lamborghini, Gerald Richards, who was also linked to this, Arch Sloan, Bobby Moore, who owned a bike shop. And according to Richard Lawson, who was one of the pedophiles who was involved in this whole group, they would abduct kids. They would pretty much get street children. They would abduct kids, feed them, but they would also force them into prostitution. And they would, like, for example, they would rape these kids in the basement of the bike shop, or they would take them to houses for other pedophiles to molest those kids as well. And so these lower class people who would ordinarily have nothing to do with these people who are wealthy and powerful would go to parties in these rich suburban areas. So you see that connection there, where these people who are procuring kids end up being linked into these higher level pedophile rings. And ultimately, with the Oakland County child killings, it seems that there is some involvement at all levels from all these different groups, from the North Fox Island people, from the people like Chris Bush, who are the middleman, and from the low-level people like Arch Sloan. First of all, the composite drawing of the composite drawing of the person who was seen abducting the kids, and this composite drawing looks a lot like Arch Sloan. And it turns out that Arch Sloan also matches the description of the young accomplice who Doug Wilson saw. Now, Doug Wilson thought that the young accomplice was an accomplice to Gacy, but it might actually be that Doug Wilson saw Chris Bush with Arch Sloan, and that would mean that Chris Bush was going out with Cass Corridor men who were involved in this pedophile operation, procuring kids and grabbing kids for the Oakland County child murders. And it turns out that some of the Cass Corridor pedophiles actually were linked to the victims through DNA. I think Arch Sloan had some hairs there were some hairs found in Arch Sloan's car. Hair the victims found in Arch Sloan's car, which basically proves that he was linked to some of these victims and transporting them at the very least. There were some other DNA matches too. I think a mitochondrial DNA match between James Gunnels, one of these other pedophiles, and I think Tim King. So basically, you have these low-level pedophiles who are linked through hard physical evidence to these Oakland County child killer victims. You have Chris Bush, who was clearly implicated, who failed his polygraph, who had a drawing that resembled one of the victims in his home. And you have Chris Bush, who is linked to the North Fox Island people. And these North Fox Island people have clients who are wealthy and powerful people all across Michigan and maybe even all across the country. So it certainly seems to me that the Oakland County child killings are a cover-up for a much larger criminal enterprise, kind of like what the Atlanta child killings were. These children are being taken off the streets, being raped and abused, and then for whatever reason, either because they were going to talk, or because they were killed in snuff films, or even possible accidental deaths, akin to what happened in the John Benet Ramsey case. These kids are killed, and then they have to be placed out and made seem as if a serial killer was grabbing them.
Yeah,
so,
just truly sick, and it's not only in the USA, it's also in Australia. I also made a video about the case in Australia, South Australia.
Oh, which case?
It's the family murders. 5 young boys being abducted, raped, and held for like a couple of days. And they were all prominent members of society.
All right, I think I do remember seeing that video. I mean, have you heard of Mr. Cool in Australia?
No.
I mean, there have been some talk on the Golden State Killer forums that this D'Angelo might be Mr. Cruel, and people don't seem to believe it, but it's at least worth checking out that case. And just one thing to bring up about the Oakland County child killers, I did bring this up in our previous episode, but the Michigan Aeronautics Commission, which is involved in approving new airstrips and all that, was at the time led by none other than James Dudley Ramsey, who is the father of John Ramsey, the grandfather of John Benet Ramsey. And I mean, that's just a very, very curious connection to see in this case, where someone who may have been involved in approving or covering up North Fox Island activities is actually the grandfather of John Benet Ramsey. And I so far haven't been able to prove whether the Michigan Aeronautics Commission was directly involved in any of this, but it's an area worthy of further investigation. And it turned out that James Dudley Ramsey, who's John Ramsey's father, was acquainted with someone named Stephen Stanislaw in Michigan. And Stephen Stanislaw's son was actually this prolific killer who murdered a bunch of people. I think he may have even murdered his own family members. And Stephen Stanislaw Jr. was at one point suspected in the Oakland County child killings. And Stephen Stanislaw Jr.'s killings were done with an aviation rope. And I think Chris Bush, when he died or was suicided, there was an aviation rope at that crime scene as well. So it makes you wonder, did Stanislaw have anything to do with silencing Bush? Was there some connection to the Oakland County child murder? And if so, are the Ramseys in any way connected to that?
Yeah.
There's a lot of directions to take this.
Thank you, George, for this conversation. It has been enlightening.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to be able to talk about this. I mean, you're doing great work, putting out all these videos. I think there are only a few of us who are doing this work right now, but I think we're beginning to wake some people up and challenge the prevailing consensus. I mean, it's important to keep doing this, find powerful evidence to show that the lone nut, the lone killer narrative is just not true, that it's obscuring a much darker reality, but one that we have to face up to.
Yeah. I will visit cavdev.org this evening for Ted Bundy, Bobby Joe Long, and also that Gary Whichway, that there was someone beside him.
Yeah. If you look on the serial killers page, you'll probably find the video. I mean, I can just tell you the name of the woman who was involved in that video. I would say
No, I will find it for myself.
Search for it. And next time, do you want to talk about the Johnny Gosch case? I know that this conversation's we've gone on for a while already. We've touched on so many things, and we certainly don't have to do it right now. But next time we talk, you want to discuss the Johnny Gosch case? Because I think that that's an important thing to bring up. It's not technically a serial killer case, but it has parallels. There are some links to the Delta Project, or possible links to the Delta Project. And
I think Filipowski was the main compositive sketch, and also Paul Benassi statement.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into more detail the next time we speak,
yeah,
but just to summarize.
And also maybe the Paul Bernard and Carlo Molker case, because I made also one of the last videos was about that case with all the news articles.
Sure. I mean, just to conclude this, talk a bit about what's been going on in the Johnny Gosch case so far. The biggest interesting thing that I found is that, first of all, and I discovered this way back in June or July of last year, is that Paul Benassi, when he was interviewed by Ted Gunderson about his abuse, was describing a ring that sounds exactly like the Delta Project, a ring in Chicago that was using pink index cards and had all these clients across the country and was prostituting boys out. So I found that interesting, and then I looked into Philip Paskey, who happens to look very similar to the sketch of one of Johnny Gosch's abductors. And as I did more research, it turns out that Paskey matches in all sorts of ways. Like, he has the same height, same long hair, blonde hair, blue eyes. He's known as a child trafficker, and he's even known to dress as a woman, which is the same description Paul Benassi gave of Tony, the abductor of Johnny Gosch, or one of the abductors of Johnny Gosch. And I was recently, I was actually in contact with William Dorsch, and I learned something else that's interesting, that near the end of Philip Paskey's life, he left Chicago and was living in California, which is important because Tony, the person who was involved in the Johnny Gosch abduction, later was involved in a child abduction case in California. So it means that we've actually now have geographic confirmation, it seems, that Philip Paskey was also in the right place at the right time for that abduction too. And I'm still following up on exactly when and exactly where he lived, but it's very promising. But finally, the most interesting component is that I came up with the Philip Paskey as a suspect for Tony and investigated that for a while. It turns out that somebody independently had come up with another suspect for the other abductor of Johnny Gosch, who was also living in Chicago at the same time and was also a pedophile. So this person's name, so the person who Paul Benassi calls him Emilio, and this person, the suspect for Emilio that this person brought up was named Roger Dean Matisse. Last name spelled Matice. So Roger Dean Matisse grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He ended up being charged with molesting a paper boy in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in the year 1966 when he was 24 years old and the paper boy was 12 years old. He eventually left Cedar Rapids and moved to Chicago, and he stayed in Chicago for many decades, including during the whole period of time that the Delta Project was operating. And then he moves to Houston, and he's in Houston for a while, and then he finally gets arrested in 2012 for distributing child pornography over the internet. And I just had to wonder, like, how likely is it that this guy molests a paper boy in 1966, is sending child pornography in 2012, and yet all the time in between that, he literally has no involvement in any sort of pedophilia whatsoever. I find that highly unlikely, and I really think that he has some kind of connection to the Delta Project in some way. I can't prove it, obviously, at this point, but I really do suspect that he does. And the fact that Matisse and Paskey both lived in Chicago at this point, that they were both implicated as suspects of the two abductors, the fact that Paskey looks quite a lot like the sketch of Tony, and Matisse looks quite a lot like the sketch of Emilio. Also, the fact that Roger Matisse's initials actually match the code name of Emilio. Emilio's code name is REM6, and if Matisse is using the nickname Emilio, it would be Roger Emilio Matisse, REM. So that actually matches as well. And it makes me think that Roger Matisse may be is a good suspect, just as Paskey is a good suspect for Tony. So, and finally, there's some indication on the People Search website that Matisse was also in San Francisco at the exact same time that the Michaela Garrett is abducted. Michaela Garrett is the person who Tony was implicated in the abduction of. Like, Tony was involved in the Gosch abduction. He was also involved in the Michaela Garrett abduction, and you see that Paskey was probably in both places at the right times, and now you see that Matisse might also be in the right place at the right time for both of them. So that's another very interesting coincidence, or maybe it's not. And I think, if anyone is interested, anyone who listens is interested in helping out, I mean, if you can find evidence that Matisse really did live in San Francisco during the late 80s, if you can find evidence that he was involved in the Delta Project or linked to other pedophile operations going on in the 70s or the 80s, I mean, anything that people can find would be very helpful. Go to the Johnny Gosch page on CapDef and learn about that. Anyway, that's just all I wanted to say, a brief overview. When we speak again, we can talk about Johnny Gosch in a lot more detail, but that's just what I wanted to get out for the moment.
Sounds very promising. Thanks, George. Good night, and we will talk about Johnny Gosch next time.
Yeah, thanks. Talk to you soon.